The moment I saw those Christmas photos on Facebook, something inside me finally broke. 68 years old, and there I was, staring at my brother's family gathered around the fireplace I had chosen, in front of the tree I had helped decorate, in the living room of the house that, well, we'll get to that part. Everyone was there. My brother Thomas, his wife Vivian, their children, the grandchildren, even the new puppy. Everyone except me. I had been deliberately cropped out, erased from the family portrait as if I'd never existed. After decades of staying silent, of making myself small for the sake of family harmony, that single act of exclusion became the thread that unraveled everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Agatha Pembroke. I never thought I'd be sharing something so personal with strangers, but sometimes life takes unexpected turns, especially when you're supposedly past the age where things should happen to you. I've always been the reliable one, the sister, who never married, who stayed in our hometown of Millfield to care for our parents through their final years. The sister who built a modest career as a high school English teacher, who saved carefully, who lived within her means. The quiet one, who never caused trouble. My brother Thomas is 7 years younger and has always been the golden child, charming, outgoing, successful in all the visible ways. He married Vivian 30 years ago, and from the very beginning, she made it clear that I was peripheral to their family unit. Little digs about my clothes, my weight, my single status. Nothing overtly cruel, just the constant subtle reminder that I wasn't quite good enough to belong. Agatha, that sweater is certainly practical, she'd say with that tight smile of hers. Or, I suppose teaching is rewarding in its own small way. I weathered it all with a patient smile because that's what family does, isn't it? You overlook the small hurts for the greater good. Besides, I adored my niece and nephews. Rebecca, the oldest, was my goddaughter. I attended every school play, every graduation, sent thoughtful gifts. I was their Aunt Aggie, dependable if not glamorous. When our parents passed away, first Dad, then Mom 5 years later, they left the family home to both Thomas and me. It was a beautiful colonial on Maple Street, nothing extravagant, but well-built and filled with memories. We had an unspoken arrangement. Thomas and his family would live there, and I would keep my small apartment downtown. It seemed the practical solution. They needed the space with 3 children. I was comfortable in my cozy one-bedroom with my books and my cat. There was just one condition I had insisted upon when we signed the papers. I would retain 50% ownership of the house, and I would contribute to its upkeep. The property taxes, insurance, and major repairs were split evenly between us. Over the years, my contribution had grown substantial. The new roof in 2010, the complete kitchen renovation in 2015, the landscaping, the sunroom addition. Even though I didn't live there, I invested in that house because it was part of my heritage too. "You're so generous, Agatha," Vivian would say, her voice honeyed but her eyes calculating. "It's wonderful that you have extra money to spend, having no children of your own." I never corrected her assumption that I had extra money. The truth was, I budgeted carefully, took on extra summer school classes, and did without certain comforts to maintain my share of the family home. But it mattered to me that the place our parents had loved was well maintained, that the grandchildren they never met had a beautiful place to grow up. Last Christmas Eve was supposed to be like any other. I arrived at 4 p.m. with my signature cranberry bread and a bag of carefully chosen presents. Thomas greeted me warmly enough, but Vivian was distracted, fussing over the placement of poinsettias for the family photos. "Oh, Agatha, you're early," she said, though I'd arrived at exactly the time we'd agreed upon. "We're just about to take family pictures. Would you mind waiting in the kitchen?" The photographer can only stay for an hour. I nodded and retreated to the kitchen, arranging my gifts under the tree while they posed and smiled in the living room. I could hear the photographer's instructions, the children's laughter, Vivian's precise directions about who should stand where. It didn't occur to me then that I wasn't being included. I simply assumed they were doing the immediate family first and would call me in later. They never did. After the photographer left, dinner was a rushed affair. Vivian seemed annoyed by my presence, checking her watch frequently. Thomas was buried in his phone. Only the children engaged with me, especially 14-year-old Sophie, who proudly showed me her art project from school. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said, admiring the intricate collage. "You have a real eye for composition." "Thanks, Aunt Aggie," she beamed. "I wish you could have been in the pictures. Mom said—" "Sophie," Vivian cut in sharply, "help your brother set the table." That night, I left earlier than usual, a heaviness settling in my chest that I couldn't quite name. It was 3 days later, scrolling through Facebook on my iPad, that I saw them. The professional family photos, posted with the caption, "Pembroke Family Christmas 2023. So blessed to have everyone we love under one roof." Everyone except me. I zoomed in on the photos, my hands shaking slightly. There was a strange gap in one picture, an awkward space where someone might have been standing. Had I been edited out? In another, the family was arranged on the staircase I had paid to refinish just last year, their faces glowing with festive cheer. 68 years old, and I sat there crying over social media like a teenager. It wasn't just the photos, it was the accumulation of 1,000 small exclusions over the years, the realization that despite my financial and emotional investment in this family, I remained an outsider. An inconvenient addition, a blank space to be cropped out. I dried my tears and made myself a cup of tea. As I stirred in the honey, a strange calm settled over me. I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled Pembroke House. Inside was every receipt, every bank statement, every legal document related to the property. 30 years of financial history, meticulously recorded in my precise handwriting. For the first time, I allowed myself to calculate exactly how much I had contributed over the decades. The numbers were staggering. While Thomas had indeed paid his half of the property taxes and insurance, I had shouldered 82% of all improvements and repairs. The current market value of the house had tripled since our parents' passing, largely due to these upgrades. I had essentially financed a significant portion of my brother's comfortable lifestyle, all while being treated as an afterthought, a maiden aunt to be tolerated rather than a co-owner to be respected. That night, I made a decision. No more. No more silent sacrifice. No more overlooked contributions. No more pretending that being excluded didn't hurt. I was done being invisible. The next morning, I called Patricia Winters, an attorney who had taught yoga with me at the senior center for years. I explained my situation, laid out my documentation, and asked a simple question. What are my options? Patricia's answer was, clear. More than you might think, Agatha. Much more. New Year's Day dawned bright and cold. I dressed with unusual care. A camel wool skirt, a burgundy cashmere sweater I had been saving for a special occasion, a touch of lipstick. I was not going to have this conversation looking like the dowdy spinster aunt they had decided I was. I arrived at the house unannounced, a manila envelope tucked under my arm. Through the front window, I could see them all in the living room, still in pajamas, watching the parade on television. My hand hesitated on the doorbell. For a moment, I considered turning back, returning to the pattern of quiet acquiescence that had defined my relationship with them for decades. Then I remembered the Christmas photos, the empty space where I should have been, and I pressed the bell firmly. Thomas answered, surprise evident on his face. Aggie? We weren't expecting you. Is everything okay? We need to talk, I said, my voice steadier than I had anticipated. All of us. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Vivian appeared behind him, her expression guarded. Thomas, who is it? Oh. Agatha. This isn't a good time. We're having a family day. I'm aware, I replied, stepping past them into the foyer. That's precisely why I'm here. This conversation concerns the family. Something in my tone must have alerted them that this wasn't the usual Agatha, the one who could be dismissed with a vague excuse. They exchanged glances, and Thomas gestured toward the kitchen. Kids, stay here and finish the parade, Vivian instructed, her voice tight. We'll be right back. In the kitchen I had paid to renovate, with its marble countertops and cherry cabinets, I placed the envelope on the table and sat down. My heart was hammering, but my resolve remained firm. I saw the Christmas photos, I began, looking directly at Vivian. The ones where I was deliberately excluded. Vivian's face flushed, but her expression remained defiant. It was just immediate. Family, Agatha. Surely you understand. No, I interrupted, surprising myself with my firmness. I don't understand. I don't understand how I can contribute to this house for 30 years, how I can be present for every milestone, every celebration, and still be considered less than immediate family. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Aggie, you're overreacting. They're just photos. They're not just photos, I said quietly. They're a symbol of where I stand with you. Both of you. And I've realized that it's not where I deserve to be. I opened the envelope and laid out the documents one by one. Property tax statements, receipts for renovations, bank transfers. A clear accounting of every dollar I had invested in the house they had come to think of as exclusively theirs. What is all this? Thomas asked, his brow furrowed. This, I said, is the reality of our arrangement. I own 50% of this house, but I've contributed far more than 50% to its value over the years. Vivian's face hardened. If this is about money, it's not about money, I cut in. It's about respect, recognition. It's about being treated as a full member of this family, not a convenient source of funds to be hidden away when the photographer comes. I slid a document across the table, the one Patricia had prepared for me. I've decided to exercise my rights as co-owner. I'm either selling my share of the house to you at current market value, with adjustments for my disproportionate contributions, or we'll need to sell the house entirely and split the proceeds. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stared at the paper, his face pale. Vivian's expression shifted from shock to anger to calculation. You can't be serious, she finally said. This is your family home too. You would force us to move. Where would we go? That would be your decision to make, I replied, keeping my voice level. Just as excluding me from the family narrative was your decision. Actions have consequences, Vivian. Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting mine. For the first time in years, he seemed to really see me, not as his dutiful older sister, but as a woman who had finally reached her limit. How much? He asked quietly. I named the figure Patricia and I had calculated. It was substantial, enough to buy a lovely cottage by the lake, with plenty left over for the retirement I had always postponed. Vivian gasped. That's ridiculous. We don't have that kind of money. Then perhaps we should list the property, I suggested. The real estate market in Millfield is quite strong right now. You would do this to us? To the children? Vivian's voice rose. After all we've done for you? I couldn't help it. I laughed. A genuine, spontaneous laugh that seemed to startle them both. What exactly have you done for me, Vivian? Made me feel unwelcome in my own family home? Accepted my financial contributions while treating me as an outsider? Please, enlighten me. Thomas reached for my hand, his expression pleading. Aggie, come on. We've always appreciated you. You know that. I gently withdrew my hand from his. Do I? When was the last time either of you acknowledged everything I've done for this family? When was the last time you made me feel valued rather than merely useful? The back door opened, and Sophie walked in, her eyes curious. Is everything okay? You guys sound upset. Vivian immediately switched to her mother voice, smooth and reassuring. Everything's fine, honey. Aunt Agatha is just discussing some boring adult business with us. It doesn't sound boring, Sophie observed, looking at the papers spread across the table. It looks important. I smiled at my great-niece, her perceptiveness reminding me of myself at that age. It is important, Sophie. Sometimes adults need to have difficult conversations to make things fair. Sophie nodded, her eyes wise beyond her years. Like when you told me I needed to speak up if Zach was taking my things without asking? Exactly. Like that, I replied. Sophie, please go back to the living room, Vivian said, her tone brooking no argument. After Sophie reluctantly left, the three of us sat in tense silence. I could almost see the wheels turning in Thomas and Vivian's minds, calculating assets, weighing options. We could take out a home equity loan, Thomas finally suggested to Vivian. She shot him a warning look. We're not discussing this now. Agatha. She turned to me, her voice suddenly honeyed. Surely we can work something out. You've always been so reasonable, so understanding. Yes, I agreed. I have been. Too understanding for too long. I gathered the papers back into the envelope and stood up. You have 30 days to decide what you want to do. After that, I'll instruct my attorney to begin the process of forcing a sale. As I walked toward the door, Vivian called after me. This is about the photos? Really, Agatha? You'd tear this family apart over something so petty? I turned back, meeting her gaze steadily. No, Vivian. The photos were simply the moment I realized my worth to this family, or rather, my lack of worth. This is about 30 years of being treated as less than while contributing more than. This is about finally valuing myself enough to say, no more. I left them sitting in the kitchen, expression stunned. As I walked to my car, a strange lightness filled me. For the first time in decades, I felt truly visible, truly present, even if that presence was now defined by its absence. The 30 days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. I received no calls, no texts, no impromptu visits. I spent the time meeting with Patricia, exploring options for where I might live if the house sold, even browsing furniture websites for pieces that would reflect my own taste rather than accommodating others' preferences. I also spent time with friends, real friends who valued my company, who included me in their lives without reservation. Jean and I took a weekend trip to the coast. Harold and I attended the symphony. I joined a book club at the library and found myself laughing more than I had in years over wine and passionate discussions of mystery novels. On the 29th day, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Sophie standing there, her bicycle leaning against the railing. Aunt Aggie, she said breathlessly, can I come in? I need to talk to you. I ushered her inside, concerned. Does your mother know you're here? She nodded, shrugging off her backpack. She does now. I left a note. I made her hot chocolate, the real kind, with milk and actual chocolate, not the powdered mix Vivian always bought, and sat with her at my small kitchen table. Mom and Dad have been fighting, she said bluntly, wrapping her hands around the mug. About the house. About you. My heart sank. I had never wanted to upset the children. I'm sorry you've had to hear that, Sophie. She shook her head. No. It's good. Dad keeps saying they should have treated you better, that you were right all along. She looked up at me, her eyes serious. He showed us all the stuff you paid for in the house, the roof and the bathrooms and everything. He said we never thanked you properly. I was speechless. This was not the reaction I had expected from Thomas. Mom's still mad, Sophie continued, with the brutal honesty of teenagers. But last night I heard her crying, saying she didn't want to move because all her friends are here and her garden club and everything. I see, I said carefully. Aunt Aggie, she leaned forward. I have an idea. But you have to promise not to tell Mom I suggested it. I raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Her idea was surprisingly practical. So practical, in fact, that when Thomas called the next day, sounding hesitant and apologetic, I was already considering something similar. We met at a neutral location, the cafe near the library where I often graded papers in my teaching days. Thomas arrived alone, looking tired but determined. Aggie, he began, I owe you an apology. Many apologies, actually. He took a deep breath. I've taken you for granted. We all have. You've been the backbone of this family, financially and emotionally, and we've repaid you with disrespect. I sipped my tea, waiting. Thomas had always been good at beginning apologies. It was following through that challenged him. Vivian and I have talked, he continued. We've also met with a financial advisor. We can't buy you out completely, not at the fair value you deserve. But we have a counter-proposal. The proposal was this. They would buy 25% of my share, giving them 75% ownership overall. I would retain 25%, and with it, the legal right to the third-floor suite, the former attic that had been converted into a charming apartment years ago, complete, with its own small kitchen and bathroom. It had been used as storage for years, but with some updating, it could become my own space within the family home. You'd have your independence, Thomas explained, your own entrance from the side staircase, but you'd also be present for family, gatherings, holidays, all the moments you should have been included in all along. I considered his words carefully. And Vivian? Is she on board with this arrangement? Thomas hesitated, then opted for honesty. She's adjusting to the idea, but she knows it's fair. More than fair, considering everything you've contributed. I nodded slowly. I appreciate the offer, Thomas, but there would need to be explicit agreements. Written agreements about my role in the family, my access to common areas, my inclusion in family events. Of course, he agreed quickly. Whatever you need. And photographs, I added, letting a small smile cross my face. I want to be in the family photographs. All of them. Thomas laughed, a genuine laugh that reminded me of our childhood. I promise. Front and center if you want. We spent the next hour outlining the details, two adults negotiating not just a living arrangement, but the reconstruction of a family relationship. It wasn't perfect, real life rarely is, but it felt like a beginning rather than an ending. 3 months later, I moved into my newly renovated third-floor suite. The space was transformed, warm, inviting, filled with light from the dormer windows. My books lined the built-in shelves. My grandmother's quilt draped across the bed. For the first time in decades, I had a space that was truly mine within the family home. The adjustment period wasn't without its challenges. Vivian was cool at first, maintaining a polite distance. But gradually, things shifted. The first thaw came unexpectedly, over gardening of all things. I had always maintained the perennial beds, a task Vivian found tedious. When spring arrived, I naturally gravitated to the garden. She found me there one morning, dividing hostas. "Those look good," she said, hovering at the edge of the flower bed. Then, almost reluctantly, "I never could get them to flourish like that." I handed her a trowel. "It's all in how you space them. Here, I'll show you." By summer, we had established a rhythm, not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect that had been missing for 30 years. Thomas made a point of consulting me on household decisions. The children, especially Sophie, often visited my suite, borrowing books or simply chatting about Their days. In July, we hosted a family barbecue. Cousins, neighbors, friends. The yard was full of people enjoying the summer evening. As twilight fell, Thomas called everyone together for a photo. "Aggie," he said, gesturing to the space beside him. "You're here, next to me." I moved into position, feeling strangely self-conscious. Vivian adjusted Sophie's hair, then stepped into place on Thomas's other side. "Everyone say Pembroke family," the neighbor called, holding up his camera. As the flash went off, I felt Sophie's arm slip around my waist, a gentle squeeze of acknowledgement. In that moment, surrounded by family in the home that now truly included space for me, I realized something profound. Standing up for yourself doesn't always mean walking away. Sometimes it means creating a new place to stand, one where you are seen, valued, and undeniably present. When the photos were posted on Facebook the next day, there I was, right in the center of the family circle. No cropping, no awkward gaps. Just Agatha Pembroke, smiling broadly, finally exactly where she belonged. The caption read, "The complete Pembroke family, together at last. Some treasures were under our roof all along." The weeks after my confrontation with Thomas and Vivian passed in a strange, suspended state. The house that had been the center of our family for generations now stood as a symbol of all that had gone unspoken between us. I returned to my apartment downtown, to my routines and my solitude. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in decades, I was no longer playing the role of the accommodating sister, the convenient aunt, the silent partner. My phone remained eerily silent. No calls from Thomas with half-hearted excuses. No messages from Vivian about some household crisis that mysteriously required my financial assistance. The children sent occasional texts, Rebecca with stiff formality, Michael not at all, and only Sophie with anything resembling genuine warmth. It was as if my ultimatum had drawn a clear line through the family, revealing the true nature of relationships I had spent years pretending were stronger than they were. Patricia called regularly, her legal mind focused on next steps should Thomas and Vivian fail to respond within our 30-day window. "We should discuss contingencies," she said one afternoon over coffee at her office. "If they refuse to buy you out or sell, we'll need to file a partition action." I nodded, the legal terminology still strange on my tongue. "And that would force the sale?" "Eventually, yes. The court would order the property sold and the proceeds divided. But Agatha—" She hesitated, setting down her cup. "It could get messy. Families often do when money and property are involved." I thought of the Christmas photos, of the careful excision of my presence from the family narrative, of 30 years of small humiliations masked as oversight. "It's already messy, Patricia. It has been for years. I just refuse to see it." That evening, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in ages. I pulled out old photo albums, not the curated family collections that lived at the main house, but my own private archive. Faded Polaroids from the 1960s, Kodachrome snapshots from family vacations, school portraits and holiday gatherings spanning decades. I was struck by a pattern I had never consciously noticed before. In the early photos, I was often at the center, the big sister proudly holding baby Thomas, the teenager helping him with homework, the young woman celebrating his college acceptance. But as the years progressed, my position shifted literally and figuratively to the margins. After Vivian entered the picture, I appeared less and less frequently, and when I did, I was invariably at the edge, sometimes partially cut off, my smile growing more fixed as time passed. The visual evidence of my gradual erasure from the family was undeniable. Had I simply failed to notice, or had I chosen not to see? I closed the album and walked to my window, looking out at the evening traffic below. My apartment sat above Henderson's bookshop, the same second-floor rental I'd taken after college when I started teaching at Millfield High. It was comfortable enough. One bedroom, a small living room with built-in bookshelves, a galley kitchen, with barely enough counter space for my tea kettle and toaster. For decades, I had told myself it was temporary, that someday I'd find a place of my own, perhaps a little cottage with a garden. But someday never came. Instead, my savings went into the family home, the slate roof that needed replacing after the ice storm of '97, the foundation repairs when water damage was discovered in 2005, the endless procession of appliances and fixtures and improvements that somehow always became my financial responsibility, while Thomas handled the practical matters of actually living in the house. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened window. Silver hair in a practical bob, reading glasses hanging from a chain around my neck, the soft lines of age around my eyes and mouth. When had I become this person? This woman who had put everyone else's needs before her own for so long that she had nearly forgotten she had needs at all. The sudden buzz of my phone startled me. Thomas's name flashed on the screen. I took a steadying breath before answering. "Hello, Thomas." "Aggie?" His voice sounded strained, almost unrecognizable. "We need to talk, not over the phone. Can you meet me tomorrow? Alone?" I hesitated, suspicion mingling with long-ingrained habit. How many times had I dropped everything when Thomas needed something? "Where?" "Dad's bench, in Riverside Park. 10 o'clock? The choice of location surprised me. Our father had donated a bench to the park before his passing, a quiet spot overlooking the river where he had taught us both to fish as children. We hadn't spoken of it in years. "I'll be there," I said finally. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake, rehearsing what I might say, how I would maintain my resolve in the face of the brotherly charm Thomas had wielded so effectively throughout our lives. By morning, I felt hollowed out, but determined. Riverside Park was quiet when I arrived, the October air crisp and scented with fallen leaves. I spotted Thomas from a distance, seated on our father's bench, shoulders hunched against the chill. He looked older somehow, diminished. For a moment, I saw him as the little boy who had once followed me everywhere, full of questions and boundless energy. The memory softened me, but I steeled myself as I approached. This wasn't about childhood, nostalgia. This was about respect, about recognition, about finally claiming what was rightfully mine. "Hello, Thomas." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Aggie, thanks for coming." He patted the bench beside him, and I sat, maintaining a careful distance. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the river flow past. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice rough. "I found something yesterday. I was going through some of Dad's old papers in the study, looking for information about the original mortgage, and I found this." He handed me a yellowed envelope. My name, written across it in our father's distinctive handwriting. I took it, confusion overriding caution. "What is this?" "I don't know. It was sealed. I didn't open it. But there was a note with it, in Dad's writing. It said to give it to you if—" He hesitated, clearing his throat. "If anything ever happened that threatened to divide us as siblings." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated just a month before our father's death. "My dearest Agatha, if you're reading this, then something has gone wrong between you and Thomas. Serious enough that he's found this letter among my things. I had hoped it would never be necessary. You've always been the responsible one, the one I could count on. Even as a child, you had an old soul, a sense of duty that sometimes worried your mother and me. We feared you might sacrifice too much of yourself for others. Thomas has always been different. Charming, yes, but also less mindful of consequences. I've tried to guide him, to instill the same sense of responsibility you came by naturally. But I fear I've failed in many ways. When your mother and I decided to leave the house to both of you, it was with the hope that it would keep you connected as family. But I worried even then that the arrangement might become unbalanced, that your generosity might be taken for granted. So I made a provision that Thomas doesn't know about. In the original deed transfer, I included a clause. If at any point your financial contribution to the property exceeds 60% of its maintenance and improvement over a period of 10 years or more, you gain the right to become the sole owner, with the requirement to buy out Thomas's portion at fair market value. My attorney, Gerald Hoffman, has kept the documentation. This was not out of distrust for Thomas, but out of love for you, and a desire to ensure you would always be protected. I hope you never need this letter. I hope you and Thomas share the family home in harmony for many years to come. But if that hasn't happened, if you've been taken advantage of, know that I tried in my way to look out for my firstborn, my brilliant girl who too often puts others before herself. With eternal love, Dad. I stared at the letter, reading it a second time. Then a third, my vision blurring with tears. All these years, our father had seen what might happen. He had known me, known us both, so well. Aggie? Thomas's voice broke through my thoughts. What does it say? I couldn't speak. I simply handed him the letter, watching as he read, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock to something like shame. I had no idea, he said finally, his voice barely audible. All this time, I never knew Dad did this. Neither did I managed. Thomas handed the letter back to me, his movements careful, almost reverential. Aggie, I've been doing a lot of thinking since you came to the house. A lot of calculating, too. He pulled out a notebook, its pages filled with columns of numbers. I started going through all the household records, trying to figure out exactly how much you've contributed over the years. He opened the notebook, pointing to the final total at the bottom of a long column. This is what I came up with. But then I found Dad's letter, and I need to know. Have you kept records? Do you know if you've met that 60% threshold? I almost laughed. The question was so absurd. Of course I had kept records. I was Agatha Pembroke, English teacher, daughter of an accountant, keeper of receipts and warranties and bank statements. Yes, Thomas, I've kept everything. And yes, I passed that threshold 15 years ago. He exhaled slowly, nodding as if he had expected this answer. So, legally, according to Dad's provision, you could claim full ownership. Not just force a sale or ask for your half, you could become the sole owner. I could, I agreed, the realization of this new power settling over me. It wasn't what I had intended when I confronted them, but now that I knew, the possibility hummed with potential. Thomas looked out at the river, his profile so like our father's it made my heart ache. Why didn't you ever say anything? All these years, all that money. Why did you keep paying for everything without complaint? The question hung between us, deceptively simple, yet impossibly complex. Why had I allowed myself to be used, to be taken for granted, to be erased? The answer had been buried so deep, within me for so long that excavating it felt like physical pain. Because I thought that was what family did, I said finally. I thought if I gave enough, if I was useful enough, if I didn't make waves, then I would belong. Really belong. Thomas turned to me, his eyes suddenly bright with tears. But you always belonged, Aggie. You're my sister, my only sister. Did I belong? I asked quietly. When Vivian excluded me from Christmas photos? When I wasn't invited to Rebecca's college graduation party until the last minute? When you all made plans in front of me for family vacations, I wasn't included. Did I truly belong then, Thomas? He flinched as if I'd struck him. I never meant. I didn't realize. That's just it, I said, the words coming faster now, decades of unspoken hurt finally finding voice. You didn't realize because you didn't have to. You were always at the center of the family picture. I was the one who had to earn my place, over and over, and somehow never quite managed it. Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook and placed it carefully on the bench between us. "You're right," he said simply. "About all of it. I've been selfish and oblivious and entitled. I let Vivian set the tone for how we treated you because it was easier than standing up for what was right. I accepted your financial help without question because it allowed us to live beyond our means. I've been a terrible brother." The stark admission hung in the autumn air. Part of me, a large part, had expected denials, justifications, the familiar dance of Thomas charming his way out of accountability. His honesty left me momentarily speechless. "What happens now?" he asked eventually. It was the question I had been asking myself for weeks. What did I truly want? Vindication? Compensation? A complete severance of family ties? Or something more complex, more difficult? A rebalancing, a recognition, a new way of being family that didn't require my invisibility? "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I need time, and I need to speak with Gerald Hoffman about this provision." Thomas nodded, standing slowly. "That's fair, more than fair." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I've already told Vivian that things have to change. Regardless of what you decide about the house, how we've treated you was wrong. I see that now." As we walked together to the park entrance, an awkward distance between us, I felt a curious mixture of emotions. Grief for what our relationship might have been, anger still simmering beneath the surface, but also a tentative hope that perhaps, after all these years, real change was possible. "I'll call you," Thomas said as we reached our cars, "when you're ready to talk again." I nodded, unable to offer more. The weight of our father's letter, of Thomas's confession, of all that remained unresolved between us, pressed heavily on my heart. That afternoon, I called Gerald Hoffman's office. The receptionist informed me that Gerald had retired 5 years earlier, but his son, Jeffrey, had taken over the practice and had access to all his father's files. I made an appointment for the following day. When I arrived at the Hoffman and A. Hoffman Law Office's, Jeffrey, a younger version of his father with the same thoughtful eyes and deliberate manner, was waiting with a thick file folder on his desk. "Ms. Pembroke," he greeted me, gesturing to a chair. "I must say, when my assistant mentioned your name, I was quite surprised. My father had left specific instructions about your file." "Instructions?" I asked. "Yes." He had a note attached, that this was to be presented to you only if you specifically inquired about a special provision in your father's estate planning, or if 30 years had passed since the transfer of the Maple Street property. He checked his watch with a small smile. "You're about 7 years ahead of schedule." I explained about finding our father's letter, about the 60% clause, about the years of imbalance in contributions to the family home. Jeffrey nodded, opening the file. "Yes, that's all here. Your father was quite forward-thinking. He created what we call a springing interest in the property. Based on the documentation you've described, it sounds as if the conditions have indeed been met." He looked up at me, his expression professional but kind. "What would you like to do with this information, Ms. Pembroke?" It was the question I had been asking myself since reading my father's letter. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Or simply, finally, recognition? "I need to understand all my options," I said carefully, "before I make any decisions." We spent the next hour going through the legal details. The provision was ironclad. If I chose to enforce it, I could become the sole owner of the house, required only to compensate Thomas for his original portion, minus an adjustment for the disproportionate contributions I had made. The amount would be significant, but far less than half the current market value. I could, in essence, take the house that Thomas and Vivian had treated as exclusively theirs for 3 decades. the house where they had raised their children. The house that, despite everything, I still thought of as our family home. The power of it was dizzying. After so many years of feeling powerless, of accepting scraps of inclusion, of funding a lifestyle I wasn't permitted to fully share in, I suddenly held all the cards. "Take some time to consider," Jeffrey advised as our meeting concluded. "This isn't a decision to make in haste. The provision isn't going anywhere." I nodded, gathering my purse and the copies of documents he had prepared for me. "Thank you, Jeffrey. Your father was a good man. My dad chose his attorney wisely." "He spoke highly of your father as well," Jeffrey said, walking me to the door. "And of you, Miss Pembroke. He always said Edward Pembroke's daughter had inherited his head for figures and his heart for family." Outside, I sat in my car for a long time, not starting the engine, just thinking. Gerald Hoffman had seen me clearly, perhaps more clearly than I had seen myself. I did have my father's head for figures, the meticulous records I'd kept proved. That. But his heart for family? That had led me to decades of silent sacrifice, of allowing myself to be marginalized, of accepting less than I deserved. What would a true heart for family look like now? Not blind sacrifice, not bitter revenge. Something else, something balanced, something just, something that might actually heal rather than simply settling old scores. I drove home slowly, mulling over possibilities. When I arrived at my apartment, I found Vivian sitting on the stairs. Outside, her normally perfect appearance slightly disheveled, her expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Agatha," she said, standing quickly, "I hope you don't mind. I needed to talk to you." I unlocked the door without speaking, gesturing for her to follow me inside. It occurred to me that in all the years we had known each other, this was the first time Vivian had ever visited my apartment. She stood awkwardly in the center of my living room, taking in the bookshelves, the comfortable reading chair, the framed botanical prints that had been my mother's. "It's lovely," she said, sounding surprised. "So peaceful." "Thank you," I replied, setting down my purse and the file from Jeffrey Hoffman. "Would you like tea?" "No, I can't stay long. The children, you know." I nodded, though. Sophie was 17, Michael 14, and Rebecca lived across town with her husband. None of them required constant supervision anymore. It was simply Vivian's habitual excuse. "What can I do for you, Vivian?" I asked, gesturing for her to sit. She perched on the edge of my sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Thomas told me about your father's letter, about the provision, in the deed." Her voice was strained, her usual confidence nowhere in evidence. He said you could take the house, legally." "I could," I confirmed, watching her carefully. She nodded rapidly, blinking back tears. "Agatha, I know we haven't always. That is, I haven't always been." She stopped, took a deep breath, and tried again. "I want to apologize." Of all the things I had expected Vivian to say, a straightforward apology was perhaps the last. I waited, uncertain whether more was coming, or if those 3 words represented the full extent of her contrition. "I was jealous," she continued, surprising me further. "From the beginning. You had this bond with Thomas that I couldn't touch. You shared all these childhood memories, inside jokes, family traditions, and you were so capable, so self-sufficient. Next to you, I felt frivolous and unnecessary." I stared at her, genuinely shocked. "You were jealous? Of me?" She nodded, a small, bitter laugh escaping her. "Ironic, isn't it? You, with your single life and your teaching job and your tiny apartment. Meanwhile, I had the husband, the beautiful house, the 3 perfect children. But somehow, I always felt I was competing with you for Thomas's attention, his respect." She looked down at her hands. "So I pushed you to the margins. I made sure the children saw me as the primary maternal figure. I planned family events around your teaching schedule, knowing you'd often have to decline. Her honesty was breathtaking, almost brutal in its clarity. I had spent years feeling excluded, never imagining that my exclusion had been not negligence but strategy. "The Christmas photos," I said quietly. Vivian had the grace to look ashamed. "Yes. I told the photographer we'd add you in later, that you were running late. I never intended to include you at all." I should have felt anger, hearing this confirmation of deliberate exclusion. Instead, I felt a strange, sad clarity. All these years, I had ascribed my marginalization to thoughtlessness, to being forgotten in the busyness of family life. The truth, that it had been intentional, calculated, was both worse and somehow cleaner. At least now I knew. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I need you to understand why I did it, before you decide about the house." She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not even asking you to change your mind. I needed you to know that it wasn't because you weren't important. It was because you were too important. You terrified me." The admission hung in the air between us, raw and real in a way nothing between us had ever been before. For 30 years, we had maintained a polite fiction of family harmony, while she systematically excluded me, and I silently endured it. Now, finally, the truth was exposed. Messy, painful, but undeniably authentic. "Thomas doesn't know I'm here," Vivian continued. "He's been different since finding your father's letter. Quiet, preoccupied. I think he's finally facing some hard truths about himself, about us, about how we've treated you." She stood, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands. "Whatever you decide, Agatha, I want you to know that I understand, and I'm sorry, truly sorry." She walked to the door, then paused, turning back. "The children miss you, especially Sophie. She keeps asking when you're coming back." And then she was gone, leaving me alone with a revelation I had never expected, and a decision that seemed to grow more complex by the hour. That evening, I took out a fresh notebook, the kind I had used for lesson planning during my teaching years, and began to write. Not records of expenses or calculations of percentages, but something different. A vision for what might be possible, for what I truly wanted my life to look like in the years ahead. I wrote about the cottage by the lake I had always dreamed of, with its garden and its quiet and its distance from painful memories. I wrote about my desire for solitude, for peace, for freedom from the constant subtle negotiations of family dynamics. But I also wrote about what I would miss. Sophie's enthusiastic updates about school projects, the familiar creak of the third stair, the way the light fell through the stained glass window in the front hall on winter afternoons. The sense, however, complicated, of belonging to something larger than myself. As midnight approached, I came to a decision, not perfect, not simple, but perhaps the closest I could come to balancing justice with mercy, self-respect with family ties. The next morning, I called Thomas. "I'd like to meet," I said when he answered. "All of us. Tomorrow evening at the house, if that works." "Of course," he replied, a note of hope in his voice. "Aggie, I've been thinking about what Dad wrote, about what you said at the park." "Tomorrow," I interrupted gently. "We'll talk about everything tomorrow." I spent the day preparing, consulting briefly with Patricia and then with Jeffrey Hoffman. By the time I arrived at the house the following evening, I felt a calm certainty about the path I had chosen. Thomas opened the door before I could ring the bell, his expression a mixture of anxiety and relief. "Aggie, thank you for coming." He gestured inside, where Vivian waited in the living room, the children gathered awkwardly beside her. "Everyone's here, as you asked." I entered the house. the house that had been both the center of my emotional life and the symbol of my exclusion from it, and took a seat in the armchair by the fireplace. My father's chair, I realized suddenly. How fitting. "I've made a decision," I began without preamble, "about the house and about our family." The tension in the room was palpable. Rebecca, always the most sensitive to atmosphere, clasped her hands tightly. Michael stared at the floor. Sophie, dear Sophie, looked directly at me, her young face serious but open. "I've consulted with Jeffrey Hoffman, Gerald's son," I continued. "He's confirmed that I could, legally, claim sole ownership of this property based on my father's provision and my disproportionate financial contributions over the years." Thomas nodded slowly. Vivian remained perfectly still, her face carefully blank. "But that's not what I want," I said, and felt the collective exhalation of relief around me. "What I want is something different. Something that I believe might actually heal our family rather than further fracture it." I reached into my bag and pulled out the documents Jeffrey had prepared for me. "I'm proposing a restructuring of ownership. The house will be divided legally into 2 separate units. The main house will remain with Thomas and Vivian. The carriage house at the back of the property, the one that's currently used for storage, will become mine. I'll renovate it into a proper living space." The carriage house had been built in the early 1900s when the property was first developed, a charming 2-story structure with good bones that had, over the decades, devolved into a glorified shed. With the right renovations, it could become a perfect small home, with the privacy I craved but still connected to the family property. "Additionally," I continued, "we'll establish a family trust for the entire property. All 5 of us as trustees." I looked at the children, including them deliberately in this moment. "This will ensure that the property remains in the Pembroke family for generations to come, regardless of individual circumstances." Thomas leaned forward, his expression cautiously hopeful. "And financially, how would this work?" "The cost of renovating the carriage house will be split according to the same percentage as our current ownership, 50-50. After that, we'll each be responsible for the maintenance of our respective living spaces while sharing the cost of overall property upkeep, landscaping, driveway, that sort of thing." I turned to Vivian, meeting her eyes directly. "There's one more condition, a non-financial one." She nodded, waiting. "Family events happen on the entire property, not just in the main house. Holiday dinners rotate between our 2 homes, and family photos, all family photos, include everyone, no exceptions." The silence that followed was profound, broken finally by Sophie, who leapt to her feet with typical teenage directness. "I think it's brilliant," she declared. "Aunt Aggie will be right there in the backyard. We can visit any time. And the carriage. House is so cool. All those windows and the loft space. It'll be amazing when it's fixed up." Rebecca smiled tentatively. "I think it sounds like a good compromise. Better than selling or other options." Michael, always the quietest, simply nodded, but there was relief in his eyes. Thomas stood and approached me, his hand extended. "Aggie, it's more than fair. It's generous. Again." I took his hand, but shook my head. "No, Thomas, not generous. Just, for the first time, just." Vivian remained seated, her expression complicated. Finally, she spoke. "The carriage house will need extensive work. The roof alone." "I'm aware," I replied calmly. "I've already had a contractor look at it. The estimate is included in the paperwork." She nodded slowly, then stood, straightening her shoulders. "Then I agree to the terms. All of them." She hesitated, then added, "And I'll make sure the family photo condition is honored. You have my word." It wasn't quite an apology, not again, but it was an acknowledgement, a beginning. Later, as I walked through the carriage house with Sophie, pointing out where I might put bookshelves, where a small kitchen could be installed. I felt a sense of rightness settle over me. This solution wasn't perfect. Nothing involving family ever is. But it offered a path forward that honored both my need for justice and my enduring attachment to this place, these people. "Will you be happy here, Aunt Aggie?" Sophie asked, her young face serious in the fading light. "Really happy?" I looked around the dusty space, seeing not what it was, but what it could become. My own place, distinct but connected, independent but not isolated. A space where I could finally, fully belong, on my own terms. "Yes," I told her, and realized with quiet surprise that I meant it. "I think I really will be." The renovation of the carriage house began in early November, a flurry of activity that transformed the once neglected structure day by day. I visited the site every afternoon, watching as the contractors gutted the interior, reinforced the beams, replaced the roof, and installed new windows that flooded the space with natural light. There was something deeply satisfying about witnessing this physical manifestation of change, this tangible evidence that my life was transforming too. Thomas had been surprisingly enthusiastic about the project, offering suggestions and even helping to clear out decades of accumulated belongings from the space. Vivian maintained a polite distance, her interactions with me cordial but reserved. The children responded in their own ways, Rebecca with practical questions about layouts and timelines, Michael with quiet curiosity, and Sophie with boundless excitement, already planning sleepovers in what she called Aunt Aggie's cottage. "Will it be done by Christmas?" she asked one brisk Saturday morning as we sorted through boxes of old decorations that had been stored in the carriage house attic. "Not quite," I told her, carefully wrapping a hand-blown glass ornament that had belonged to our mother. "The contractor says February at the earliest. These things take time if you want them done properly." Sophie nodded sagely, as if she were well versed in the complexities of residential construction. "But you'll still have Christmas with us. In the main house, right? In the dining room like always?" I hesitated. Despite our agreement about family events, I hadn't quite decided how to approach the holidays. The memory of last Christmas, of being excluded from the photos, of feeling like an unwelcome appendage to the family celebration, remained a tender bruise. "I'm not sure yet, sweetheart," I said finally. "I might travel this year. Jean has invited me to join her in Vermont. Her daughter has a ski lodge there." Sophie's face fell. "But you can't miss Christmas. You've never missed Christmas." I smiled gently at her. "Sometimes change is good, Sophie. Sometimes it's necessary." She considered this, her young face serious. "If you don't come, will you at least call? So I can tell you what I got and everything?" "Of course," I promised, touched by her concern. "Wild horses couldn't keep me from hearing about your Christmas morning." Later, as I walked back to the main house with a box of salvaged decorations, I found Thomas in the kitchen, awkwardly attempting to prepare lunch for the children. A splatter of tomato soup decorated his sweater, and half-made sandwiches were arranged haphazardly on plates. "Need some help?" I offered, setting down the box. He looked up, relief evident in his expression. "Please. I don't know how you and Vivian make this look so easy." I washed my hands and took over the sandwich assembly, efficiently slicing cheese and arranging turkey while Thomas stirred the soup. It felt strange to be working alongside him in this domestic scene, like actors who had suddenly switched roles in a long-running play. "Vivian's at her mother's," he explained as we worked. "Some crisis with the holiday planning. She took Rebecca with her." I nodded, unsurprised. Vivian's mother, Eleanor, was a formidable woman who approached Christmas with military precision and expected her daughter's full participation. Rebecca, now 23 and engaged, was being gradually integrated into the tradition. "Sophie mentioned you might not join us for Christmas this year," Thomas said after a moment, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm considering other options. I confirmed, focusing on the task at hand. Because of last year. It wasn't a question, so I didn't treat it as one. I simply continued preparing lunch, aware of Thomas watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It would mean a lot to me, to all of us, if you'd reconsider, he said finally. Especially now, with everything changing. It feels important that we do this right. Together. I looked up at him then, this brother who had been at the center of my life for as long as I could remember. Despite everything, there was still a part of me that instinctively responded to his needs, that wanted to smooth his path, solve his problems. It was a habit formed over 6 decades, not easily broken. I'll think about it, I said, neither committing nor refusing. Thomas nodded, accepting this as the most he could expect for now. That's all I ask. December arrived with a dusting of snow and the usual flurry of holiday preparations. The renovation continued steadily, the carriage house now fully enclosed with new windows and doors, the interior taking shape with freshly framed walls and roughed-in plumbing. I found myself spending more time there than at my apartment, bundled against the cold as I discussed paint colors with the contractor or made decisions about cabinet placement. One afternoon, I was measuring for bookshelves when I heard a car pull up outside. Through the new bay window, I saw Eleanor Whitman's gleaming Mercedes, with Vivian in the passenger seat. I watched as they sat for a moment, clearly deep in conversation. Vivian gesturing emphatically while her mother maintained her usual rigid posture. Finally, they emerged from the car, Eleanor leading the way toward the carriage house with determined steps, Vivian trailing behind with visible reluctance. I opened the door before they could knock. "Eleanor?" I greeted her, keeping my tone neutral. "This is a surprise." "Agatha?" she replied with the crisp nod that was her version of warmth. Eleanor had never been an effusive woman. "I understand you're transforming this old outbuilding into a residence." "That's right," I confirmed, stepping aside to allow them entry. "It's not much to look at yet, but if you'd like to see the progress." Eleanor swept past me, her assessing gaze taking in the exposed beams, the unfinished walls, the plastic sheeting covering the areas yet to be worked on. Vivian followed, avoiding my eyes, her discomfort evident in the tight set of her shoulders. "It's smaller than I expected," Eleanor commented, moving through the space with the practiced eye of someone who had overseen multiple renovations. "But I suppose it's adequate for one person." I suppressed a smile at her characteristic bluntness. Eleanor had never been one for social niceties or false flattery. In some ways, I had always respected that about her, even when her directness tended toward criticism. "It's perfect for my needs," I replied. "Just over 1,000 square feet when it's finished. The upstairs will be my bedroom and a small study. Down here, an open living area, kitchen, and a small dining space." Eleanor nodded, running a gloved finger along the window frame. "The woodwork is solid. That's good. And these windows capture the southern exposure nicely." "Mother has some questions about the Christmas arrangements," Vivian interjected, clearly eager to move beyond pleasantries to the purpose of their visit. "Vivian tells me you're considering absence this year," Eleanor said, turning to face me directly. "I've come to persuade you otherwise." This was unexpected. Eleanor and I had maintained a cordial but distant relationship over the decades. She had always treated me with a sort of detached respect, acknowledging my role in the family, but never particularly seeking my company. That she would involve herself in this situation surprised me. "I'm still deciding," I said carefully. "Well, decide to attend," Eleanor replied crisply. "This family has had quite enough disruption lately. The holidays are for healing rifts, not widening them." I glanced at Vivian, who was studying an exposed beam with unusual intensity, clearly uncomfortable with her mother's directness. "The disruption, as you call it, wasn't of my making," I pointed out. "After 30 years of contributing to this family in every way I could, I was deliberately excluded from its documentation. That's not a small hurt, Eleanor. Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. No, I imagine it wasn't. Vivian has explained the situation to me, rather belatedly. She shot her daughter a pointed look. It was poorly handled, to say the least. This acknowledgement, coming from Eleanor, carried significant weight. She had always been Vivian's staunchest defender, quick to dismiss any criticism of her only daughter. That she would concede this point even obliquely was remarkable. Nevertheless, she continued, moving forward is now the priority. The family trust you've established, the division of the property, these are sensible solutions, but they will only succeed if the emotional bonds are maintained alongside the legal structures. She gestured around the unfinished space. This physical separation need not become an emotional one as well. I studied Eleanor, suddenly seeing her in a new light. Beneath her starched exterior and social formality, she was a woman who understood the complex dynamics of family, who recognized the delicate balance between independence and connection. The Christmas Eve dinner will be here this year, Vivian said, finally meeting my eyes. Not at Mother's, not at our house, here in Millfield, and we would. I would like it very much if you would attend. The invitation was clearly difficult for her to extend. Vivian had always been the unquestioned orchestrator of family gatherings, the one who determined guest lists and seating arrangements and menus. To cede even a portion of that control represented a significant concession. And the Christmas photos? I asked, unable to resist pressing the point. We'll absolutely include you, Eleanor answered firmly before Vivian could speak. In fact, I've already spoken with Jeffrey at the portrait studio. He'll be coming to the house at 4 o'clock sharp. I've instructed him that every configuration of the family is to be photographed. The entire group, smaller groupings, individuals with various family members. No one will be excluded. I almost smiled at the thought of poor Jeffrey receiving instructions from Eleanor Whitman. He wouldn't dare miss a single possible combination. Please say yes, Agatha, Vivian said quietly. For the children. For all of us. There was a sincerity in her voice I had rarely heard before, an absence of the subtle edge that had characterized so many of our interactions over the years. Whether this represented genuine change or simply pragmatic adjustment to the new reality of our family structure, I couldn't be sure, but it was at least an effort. All right, I agreed finally. I'll be there. Eleanor nodded briskly as if she had never doubted the outcome. Excellent. 4 o'clock for photographs, dinner at 6. Wear something festive but not red. It clashes with the decorations. She headed for the door, then paused, turning back. And Agatha? The renovations are coming along well. It will be a lovely home. After they left, I stood for a long time, in the center of the unfinished space, considering the conversation. Eleanor's intervention had been unexpected, but perhaps it shouldn't have been. She was, above all, a pragmatist. She had assessed the situation and determined that family harmony, or at least the appearance of it, was the priority. Her directness had accomplished what weeks of awkward interactions between Vivian and me had not, a clear path forward for the immediate future. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. The renovation continued at a steady pace, though a delay in the delivery of custom cabinets ensured I wouldn't be moving in before the new year. My apartment began to feel transitional, boxes half-packed in corners, decisions being made about what to keep and what to discard after decades of accumulation. Sophie visited often, helping me sort through belongings, offering enthusiastic opinions about everything from paint colors to furniture placement. Her unfiltered excitement about my new home was a balm, a reminder that not every relationship in the family had been strained by recent events. We should have a sleepover as soon as it's finished, she declared one evening as we organized my book collection, deciding which volumes would make the move. Just you and me. We can stay up late and read and have breakfast for dinner." "Breakfast? For dinner?" I echoed, amused. "Yes. Pancakes and scrambled eggs at like 9 p.m. It's the best." She handed me a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, one I had taught from for years. "This is definitely coming to the new house, right? It's your favorite." I took the book, touched by her observation. "You remembered." "Course I did. You used to read it to me when I was little. You did all the voices." She grinned. Mr. Darcy sounded very serious and important. These moments with Sophie were bright spots in what remained, despite progress, a complex family situation. Thomas and I had established a tentative new pattern, more equal than our previous dynamic, but still finding its footing. Vivian maintained a careful politeness that occasionally, when she forgot herself, slipped into the more genuine warmth I had glimpsed in our conversation with Eleanor. Christmas Eve arrived with picture-perfect snowflakes drifting lazily past my window. I dressed with unusual care, a deep green velvet dress I had purchased for the occasion, pearl earrings that had been my mother's, a touch more makeup than my usual minimal application. As I prepared to leave, I caught my reflection in the mirror and was momentarily startled. The woman looking back at me seemed different somehow, more assured, perhaps, more present. The main house was transformed when I arrived, every surface gleaming, the scent of pine and cinnamon in the air. Vivian had outdone herself, as she did every year, with a towering tree in the front bay window and garlands wound around the staircase. But there were subtle differences this year. I noticed my mother's antique glass ornaments prominently displayed on the tree, and a framed photograph of my parents I hadn't seen in years placed on the mantel. "You're here," Sophie exclaimed, hurrying down the stairs to embrace me. She was dressed in a navy blue dress with a velvet headband, looking suddenly older than her 14 years. "Of course I am," I told her, returning the hug. "I promised. Didn't I?" The next hours passed in a carefully choreographed dance of family traditions. Jeffrey from the portrait studio arrived precisely at 4, as Eleanor had promised, setting up his equipment in the living room with the efficiency of someone who knew better than to waste a Whitman's time. "Mrs. Pembroke?" He greeted me warmly. "Wonderful to see you again. I was thinking we'd start with some individual portraits, then move to family groupings. Would that work for you?" The pointed inclusion, the deference to my preference, was clearly by design. I smiled, accepting this small act of recognition. "That sounds perfect, Jeffrey." The photography session unfolded just as Eleanor had dictated, with every possible combination meticulously captured. Thomas and me, Vivian and me, the children with me alone, the entire family together. No one excluded, no one marginalized. Vivian, to her credit, arranged each grouping with apparent sincerity, ensuring I was centered, visible, undeniably present. As Jeffrey packed up his equipment, promising digital proofs by the weekend, I caught Thomas watching me, his expression thoughtful. "What?" I asked, self-conscious under his scrutiny. "Nothing," he said, then reconsidered. "Actually, no, it's not nothing. I was just thinking how right this feels. Having you here, properly included. It should always have been this way." The simple acknowledgement, offered without prompting, caught me off guard. "Yes," I agreed softly. "It should have." Dinner was served at 6, as promised. The dining table extended to its full length and set with the good china and crystal that had been our mother's. Eleanor presided at one end, Thomas at the other, with the rest of us arranged between. The conversation flowed more easily than I had expected, guided deftly by Eleanor whenever it threatened to stall or veer into potentially fraught territory. As the meal concluded and we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, I found myself seated beside Eleanor on the sofa, slightly apart from the others. "This has gone well," she observed quietly, watching as Rebecca showed off her engagement, ring to Sophie for what was likely the 100th time. "Yes," I agreed. Better than I expected. Eleanor nodded, her gaze still on the family tableau before us. Vivian can be difficult, she said after a moment, surprising me with her candor. She comes by it honestly, I'm afraid. I wasn't an easy mother. She glanced at me briefly. You've shown considerable grace, Agatha. More than many would have in your position. Coming from Eleanor, this was extraordinary praise. I accepted it with a simple nod, unsure how to respond to this unexpected vulnerability from a woman who had always presented such a formidable exterior. The carriage house, she continued, is a good solution. Independence without isolation. I approved as soon as Vivian told me. A small smile touched her lips. Not that my approval was sought or required, but I offered it nonetheless. It feels right, I told her. A space that's truly mine, but still connected to the family. Yes. Eleanor sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Sometimes separation is necessary before true reconnection is possible. I learned that with Vivian after her father died. We needed distance before we could find our way back to each other. This glimpse into Eleanor's relationship with her daughter, this suggestion of past struggles and reconciliations, humanized her in a way I had never experienced before. Perhaps age had softened her, or perhaps she had always possessed this depth of reflection beneath her starchy exterior. I want you to know, she said, setting down her cup with precision, that I've spoken to Vivian quite firmly about her behavior toward you over the years. It was unacceptable, regardless of her insecurities or her motivations. Family is family. You don't exclude family. The declaration, delivered with Eleanor's characteristic definitiveness, brought a sudden lump to my throat. All these years, I had longed for exactly this validation, this acknowledgement that my belonging should have been unconditional, that my worth should never have been in question. Thank you, Eleanor, I managed, blinking back unexpected tears. She nodded once, as if the matter was now settled, and rose to join the others, leaving me to compose myself privately. Later, as the evening wound down and gift exchanges concluded, Sophie presented me with a small package wrapped in silver paper. It's just something little, she said, suddenly shy. For your new house. I unwrapped it carefully to find a delicate glass ornament, a miniature carriage house, hand-painted with exquisite detail. I had it custom-made, Sophie explained. I found this artist online who does special ornaments. I sent her pictures of our carriage house and told her about you moving there. Do you like it? I held the small replica up to the light, marveling at the tiny windows, the perfect proportions, the careful attention to detail. Sophie, it's beautiful. Absolutely perfect. I thought maybe it could be the start of your own ornament collection, she said, for your tree next year in your new place. The thoughtfulness of the gift, the recognition of my new beginning touched me deeply. I'll treasure it, I promised, hugging her close. As I prepared to leave, gathering my coat and the small gifts I had received, Vivian approached, her expression unusually tentative. Before you go, she said, there's something I'd like to show you. She led me to the study, Thomas's domain for as long as I could remember, and gestured toward the large computer monitor on the desk. Jeffrey sent over a preview of one of the photos. I thought you might like to see it. On the screen was an image from earlier that evening, the full family grouped around the Christmas tree. But unlike previous years, where I had been relegated to the edges if included at all, in this photo, I stood prominently in the center, flanked by Thomas and Vivian, with the children arranged around us. We were all smiling, looking genuinely happy, a unified family. This is the one we're sending out as our Christmas card, Vivian said quietly. And posting on social media, of course. I've already written the caption, "The complete Pembroke family together for Christmas." The deliberate echo of my exclusion from last year's photos, the intentional correction of that wrong, was unmistakable. It was, in its way, the most direct acknowledgement Vivian had yet offered of the hurt she had caused. "Thank you," I said simply. She nodded, a flicker of something that might have been relief crossing her face. "Merry Christmas, Agatha." "Merry Christmas, Vivian." As I drove home through the gently falling snow, I reflected on the evening, the careful inclusion, the small moments of genuine connection, the tentative steps toward a new family dynamic. It wasn't perfect. The wounds of decades couldn't be healed in a single night. The patterns of a lifetime couldn't be rewritten with one successful dinner. But it was a beginning, a foundation upon which something new and potentially better might be built. The carriage house renovation would be completed in February. My new life would begin in earnest then, in a space that was truly mine, shaped by my preferences, reflective of my identity. But the emotional renovation, the restructuring of relationships, the recalibration of expectations, the establishment of new boundaries, had already begun. As I unlocked the door to my apartment, I carefully placed Sophie's ornament on my small tabletop tree, positioning it where the light would catch its delicate details. It was, as she had said, the start of a new collection, a symbol of the future I was building, one choice at a time. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in months, the weight of resentment and hurt that had pressed on me for so long, finally beginning to lift. Not gone completely, perhaps, but lighter, manageable, no longer defining my experience of family or my sense of self. The new year dawned bright and cold, full of promise and possibility. I stood at my apartment window, watching the sun rise over the familiar buildings of Millfield, a town I had never left, though I had sometimes dreamed of escape. Now, paradoxically, by claiming my space within the family property, I had found a different kind of freedom, not geographic but emotional. The freedom that comes from being seen, from being valued, from finally, after all these years, truly belonging. February arrived with a week of unexpected warmth, as if spring were offering a brief preview of its eventual return. The timing couldn't have been better, as it coincided perfectly with the completion of my carriage house. The contractors finished the last details, installing light fixtures, hanging the final cabinet doors, touching up paint, while I packed the remainder of my belongings in the downtown apartment that had been my home for decades. "You're really doing this," Jean remarked as she helped me wrap dishes in newspaper. "I have to admit, Agatha, when you first told me about your plan, I wasn't sure you'd go through with it." I carefully placed a wrapped teacup in a box, considering her words. "I wasn't entirely sure either," I admitted. Part of me kept waiting for something to go wrong, for Thomas to change his mind, for Vivian to sabotage the renovation somehow, for some legal complication to arise. Jean chuckled, shaking her head. Ever the pessimist. "Realist," I corrected with a smile. "When you've spent as many years as I have adjusting your expectations downward, it takes time to believe that things might actually work out as planned." We continued packing in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crinkling of newspaper and the occasional clink of porcelain. Jean had been my closest friend since we'd taught together at Millfield High, she in mathematics and I in English. We'd supported each other through the decades, her divorce, my parents' deaths, her children's tumultuous adolescences, my complicated family dynamics. If anyone understood the significance of this move, it was Jean. "Have you decided about the housewarming?" she asked eventually. I nodded, taping a box closed with decisive strokes. "Next Saturday. Nothing elaborate, just wine and cheese. A chance for people to see the place. You'll come, of course." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Jean assured me. "I'm dying to see what you've done with the space. And I'm bringing a proper housewarming gift, so prepare yourself." "Nothing extravagant," I warned, knowing her tendency toward generosity. She waved dismissively. It's not every day my best friend gets a custom-renovated carriage house. Let me enjoy this. The moving day itself was surprisingly smooth. Thomas had arranged for professional movers, insisting on covering the cost despite my protests. Consider it partial repayment for decades of imbalance, he'd said when I tried to refuse. I'd eventually acquiesced, recognizing that allowing him to contribute in this way was its own form of grace. The movers arrived precisely on schedule, efficiently loading my belongings into their truck. I'd been ruthless in my culling, donating bags of clothes I no longer wore, selling furniture that wouldn't fit the new space, passing beloved books to former students who had expressed interest. What remained were the true essentials, items that held genuine meaning or served practical purpose. As the last box was carried out, I stood in the center of the empty apartment, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. This space had sheltered me through most of my adult life. Within these walls, I had graded thousands of essays, weathered countless storms, both literal and metaphorical, celebrated small victories and mourned deep losses. Leaving felt both like abandonment and liberation. "Ready, Miss Pembroke?" the lead mover asked from the doorway. I took a final look around, mentally bidding farewell to this chapter of my life. "Yes," I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. "I'm ready." The drive to the family property took less than 15 minutes, a journey I had made countless times over the years. But today felt different, weighted with significance. I wasn't visiting. I was coming home. To a home that was truly mine. As we turned into the long driveway, I caught my first glimpse of the carriage house in its completed state. The transformation was remarkable. What had once been a weathered utilitarian structure now stood proud and welcoming, its cedar shingles freshly stained, new windows gleaming in the winter sunlight. A charming Dutch door painted a deep teal, a color I had chosen carefully, wanting something distinctive yet dignified. Thomas was waiting outside, hands in his pockets against the chill. When he saw the moving truck, he waved, then hurried to meet us as we pulled up. "Welcome home, Aggie," he said as I stepped out of my car. There was genuine warmth in his voice, without the undercurrent of guilt or obligation that had colored so many of our recent interactions. "It looks wonderful," I told him, gazing up at the carriage house. "Even better than I imagined." "Wait until you see inside," he replied, clearly pleased by my reaction. "The painters finished the last touch-ups yesterday, and the cleaning crew just left an hour ago. Everything's ready." The movers had begun unloading, carrying boxes and furniture toward the house. Thomas and I followed, pausing at the threshold of my new home. I took a deep breath, then stepped inside. The interior exceeded even my highest expectations. Sunlight streamed through the new windows, illuminating the open living area with its fresh white walls and oak floors. The kitchen gleamed with marble countertops and brass hardware, simple but elegant. A wood-burning fireplace anchored the far wall, flanked by built-in bookshelves waiting to be filled. The staircase to the upper level curved gracefully against the wall, its wrought iron railing a perfect blend of modern and traditional design. "Oh," I breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. "It's perfect." Thomas smiled, clearly relieved. "I was hoping you'd think so. The contractor said you were the most decisive client he'd ever worked with. Knew exactly what you wanted. No waffling." "Years of untapped opinions," I replied wryly. "Apparently, I've had very specific ideas about interior design all along." The movers worked efficiently, placing furniture according to my directions, stacking boxes in the appropriate rooms. Thomas stayed throughout the process, helping to position the heavier pieces, unpacking kitchen items, offering suggestions about furniture arrangement that I occasionally accepted, and more often politely declined. It was a new dynamic for us, collaborative rather than hierarchical, my preferences taking clear precedence in this space that was undeniably mine. By late afternoon, The fundamental moving was complete. My clothes hung in the bedroom closet. My kitchen items filled the cabinets. My books lined the shelves. Smaller decorative items remained to be placed, pictures to be hung, but the essentials were settled. The carriage house had transformed from a construction project to a home. My home. "I should let you get on with settling in," Thomas said, as the movers departed. "You probably want some time alone to arrange things." "Actually," I said, surprising myself, "I wouldn't mind company while I unpack a few more things. If you don't have other plans." Thomas looked genuinely pleased by the invitation. "No plans. Vivian took the kids to visit her cousin in Hartford for the weekend. I'm entirely at your disposal." So we spent the next few hours unpacking together, hanging artwork, arranging bookshelves, debating the optimal placement for lamps and side tables. It was the longest stretch of time Thomas and I had spent alone together in years, perhaps decades, and I was struck by how easy it felt. Without Vivian's mediating presence, without the weight of unspoken resentments, we found our way back to something that resembled our childhood rapport. Comfortable, gently teasing, mutually respectful. "Remember when Dad tried to build shelves in my room?" Thomas asked as we struggled to level a particularly challenging picture frame. They listed to the left so badly that anything round would roll right off. I laughed, the memory surfacing vivid and warm. Mother was furious. She'd told him to hire someone, but he insisted he could do it himself. He was always like that, determined to handle everything personally, even when he was clearly out of his depth. Thomas stepped back, eyeing the now level frame with satisfaction. "I think I inherited some of that stubbornness." "Some?" I raised an eyebrow. He chuckled, conceding the point. "All right, more than some. It's a Pembroke trait." He glanced at me, his expression softening. "You got the better qualities. Dad's precision. Mother's eye for beauty. I got the hard-headedness." "And the charm," I added fairly. "You could talk your way out of trouble from the time you could speak. I always envied that." Thomas looked surprised. "You envied me? I thought it was all the other way around. You were the smart one, the capable one. I was just the loud little brother trailing in your wake." This perspective, that Thomas might have envied me as much as I sometimes envied him, was entirely new, forcing me to reconsider decades of family dynamics through a different lens. Had we both been caught in a cycle of misperception, each assuming the other held the advantage? As evening approached, we ordered pizza, a rare indulgence that felt appropriate for the occasion. We ate at my new kitchen island, perched on the bar stools I had selected for their comfort and clean lines, the pizza box open between us, glasses of red wine at our elbows. "To new beginnings," Thomas proposed, raising his glass in a toast. I clinked my glass against his. "And to finally understanding old patterns." He nodded, acknowledging the deeper meaning in my words. "I've been thinking a lot about that, about how we fell into certain roles as kids and just stayed there, even when they stopped serving us, even when they became harmful. It's hard to break patterns that feel like they're woven into your identity," I observed. For so long, I was the responsible one, the one who sacrificed, who accommodated. I didn't know how to be anything else. And I was the charming one, the one who received rather than gave. Thomas swirled the wine in his glass, his expression thoughtful. It worked when we were children. It became toxic when we were adults. The frank acknowledgement of these dysfunctional patterns, spoken aloud without defensiveness or accusation, felt like another threshold crossed. We were no longer merely acting out our reconciliation. We were understanding it, integrating it into a new shared narrative. "Vivian wants to host a dinner next week," Thomas said after a moment, carefully casual. "Nothing formal, just family. To welcome you properly to your new home." I hesitated, automatic wariness rising at the mention of Vivian. Despite the progress we had made over Christmas, our relationship remained the most tenuous of my family connections, built on decades of mutual suspicion and resentment. Thomas noticed my hesitation. She's trying, Aggie, in her way. This is difficult for her. She's used to being the central female figure in the family, having to share that role, having to acknowledge that she's treated you poorly. It's a significant adjustment. I appreciated his honesty, the lack of pressure, in his tone. I understand that, I said finally. And yes, dinner would be fine, but perhaps not next week. I'd like some time to settle in, to enjoy this space as my own before integrating it into the larger family routine. Of course, he agreed immediately. No rush, whenever you're ready. After Thomas left, I wandered through my new home in the gathering dusk, touching surfaces, adjusting small items, absorbing the reality that this space, this beautiful, thoughtfully designed space, was mine. I lit a fire in the fireplace, delighting in the warm glow it cast across the room. Then I curled up in my favorite reading chair, a book open on my lap, but my attention focused on the dancing flames and the sense of profound contentment that had settled over me. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt completely at home. Not merely sheltered, not simply accommodated, but truly at home in a space that reflected my tastes, my preferences, my essence. The housewarming party the following Saturday exceeded all my expectations. Jean arrived first, as promised, bearing a handmade quilt in shades of teal and cream that complemented my color scheme perfectly. I've been working on it since you first told me about the carriage house, she confessed as I admired the intricate pattern. Finished the binding just yesterday. Other friends followed, former colleagues from the high school, members of my book club, neighbors from my old apartment building. They explored the space with appropriate admiration, asking questions about the renovation process, complimenting my design choices, leaving thoughtful gifts, potted plants, bottles of wine, scented candles. I had invited Thomas and his family, of course, though I'd made it clear that this was primarily a gathering of my friends. They arrived midway through the afternoon, joining the celebration with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Thomas circulated, comfortably, charming my friends as he always did. Vivian maintained a polite smile, though I noticed her scrutinizing the details of the house with an appraising eye. Michael seemed bored but dutiful. Rebecca brought her fiancé, both of them, making appropriate appreciative comments before finding a corner to occupy together. Only Sophie showed genuine excitement, bouncing from room to room, pointing out features she had helped select, proudly informing everyone that she had been my design consultant. Her enthusiasm was infectious, drawing smiles even from my most reserved friends. Your niece is delightful, John murmured as we watched Sophie earnestly explaining the benefits of the Dutch door to my former department chair. She has your spirit. The observation startled me. I had never thought of Sophie and myself as particularly similar. She was outgoing where I was reserved, artistic where I was analytical. But perhaps John saw something deeper, some shared quality that connected us across generations and temperamental differences. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, I found myself standing in the kitchen with Vivian, both of us loading the dishwasher in silent efficiency. The house turned out well, she said after a moment, her tone carefully neutral. Better than I expected, honestly. Coming from Vivian, this was high praise. Thank you, I replied. I'm very pleased with it. She nodded, arranging wine glasses in the top rack with precise movements. Sophie can't stop talking about it. She's already planning movie nights and baking sessions and who knows what else. I hope you don't mind her enthusiasm. Not at all, I assured her. Sophie is always welcome here. All of you are. Vivian glanced at me, her expression unreadable. That's generous of you. considering everything. I chose my next words carefully, wanting to be honest without reopening wounds that had begun to heal. It's not about generosity, Vivian. It's about creating a new pattern for our family, one where everyone feels valued and included. She absorbed this, her hands stilling on the plate she was rinsing. I haven't made that easy, she acknowledged finally. I know that. It was as close to a direct apology as Vivian had ever offered, delivered in the familiar context of household tasks, without eye contact or emotional display. Yet it felt genuine, a recognition of past wrongs without excuses or qualifications. No, I agreed simply. You haven't. But things can be different now. She nodded once, resuming her methodical loading of the dishwasher. We finished the task, in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than had existed between us before, less tense, more thoughtful. Not friendship exactly, but perhaps the beginning of mutual respect. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to my life. I settled into the carriage house as if I'd always belonged there, quickly adapting to its spaces and quirks. The south-facing windows that flooded the living room with morning light. The way the old wooden floors creaked slightly in certain spots. The perfect acoustics in the bathroom that made even my mediocre singing voice sound pleasant. I established new routines and preserved cherished old ones. Coffee on the small deck each morning, weather permitting. Reading by the fire in the evenings, weekly lunches with Jean, monthly book club meetings, now hosted in my own home rather than at the library. My relationship with the main house, with the family, evolved as well. I visited regularly, but on my terms, no longer the supplicant grateful for inclusion, but an equal participant in family life. Sometimes Sophie would knock on my door after school, seeking help with an English assignment, or simply company different from her parents. Occasionally Thomas would stop by with a bottle of wine, and we'd talk late into the evening, excavating old memories, constructing new understandings. Vivian remained more distant, but the sharp edges of our interactions had softened. We would never be close in the conventional sense, but we had achieved a kind of détente, a mutual recognition that we were permanently connected through Thomas and the children, through the shared property, through decades of entwined history. One evening in early April, as the first daffodils were beginning to bloom in the beds I had planted along my walkway, I heard a knock at my door. Opening it, I found Rebecca standing there, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Aunt Aggie," she began, then hesitated. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," I assured her, stepping aside to welcome her in. Rebecca's visits were rare. Of all the children, she had remained the most reserved toward me since the family restructuring. The most loyal to her mother's perspective. "Would you like some tea?" She nodded, following me to the kitchen, perching awkwardly on one of the bar stools as I filled the kettle. I noticed she was carrying a thick binder, which she placed carefully on the counter. "I'm here about the wedding," she said as I set out cups and tea bags. "It's less than 3 months away now, and there are some decisions I need to make." I nodded encouragingly, unsure where this was leading. Rebecca's engagement to David, a pleasant young accountant she had met at work, had been announced the previous summer. The wedding was scheduled for July, an outdoor ceremony at Eleanor's country club followed by a reception that promised to be as elegant and controlled as Eleanor and Vivian could make it. "Mom and Grandma have been very involved in the planning," Rebecca continued, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the binder cover. "Which is helpful, mostly. But sometimes I feel like I'm just going along with what they want, rather than making my own choices." The kettle whistled, and I busied myself preparing our tea, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "Anyway," she went on, accepting the steaming cup I offered, "I've been thinking about the something borrowed tradition. Mom wants me to use her pearl earrings, which are beautiful, but..." She took a deep breath. I was wondering if you might have something I could borrow instead. Something that was Grandma Pembroke's, maybe. The request caught me entirely by surprise. Rebecca and I had never been particularly close, even before the family discord. That she would come to me for this significant wedding tradition, bypassing her mother's preference in the process, felt monumental. "I'd be honored," I said, careful to keep my tone measured despite my emotion. "I have several pieces of Mother's jewelry. We could look at them together if you'd like." Relief washed over Rebecca's face. "I was hoping you'd say that. And there's one more thing." She opened the binder, revealing meticulously organized wedding plans. The ceremony readings. David and I each get to choose one. He's picked something from his favorite philosopher, and I wanted something literary. Beautiful language, you know? I thought, since you taught English all those years, you might have suggestions. I was touched by her faith in my expertise, by this acknowledgement of my professional identity that had often been overlooked within the family. "I'd be happy to help." "Are you thinking poetry, prose, something traditional or more contemporary?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. "That's why I came to you. I want something that feels right, that means something." We spent the next hour reviewing possibilities, paging through my poetry collections, discussing themes and tones and contexts. Rebecca revealed a depth of literary appreciation I hadn't known she possessed, responding thoughtfully to each suggestion, asking perceptive questions. "This one," she said finally, touching a page in my well-worn anthology of love poetry. "This is it." The poem she had chosen was one of my favorites, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnet 43, "How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways." A classic. Choice, perhaps, but no less powerful for its familiarity. "It's perfect," I agreed. "Traditional but not cliché. Emotional without being sentimental." Rebecca smiled, the most genuine smile she had directed at me in years. "And I'd like you to read it, at the ceremony." The invitation, to participate not merely as a guest, but as an active part of the wedding, to share in this milestone moment, left me momentarily speechless. "Are you sure?" I asked when I found my voice. "Your mother might prefer—" "I'm sure," Rebecca interrupted firmly. "It's my wedding. I get to choose, and I choose you for this." After she left, carrying a small velvet pouch containing my mother's sapphire bracelet and a copy of the sonnet, I sat for a long time by the fireplace, marveling at the unexpected turn the evening had taken. Rebecca's visit represented more than a wedding preparation errand. It was a deliberate choice to include me in a significant way, to acknowledge my place in the family narrative. It occurred to me that the changes in our family dynamic were rippling outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. My stand for recognition, for respect, had altered not just my relationship with Thomas and Vivian, but with the younger generation as well. Rebecca, observing the shifts in the family power structure, was making her own adjustments, perhaps seeing me in a new light, not merely as her father's sister, but as a woman with her own identity, her own value, her own contributions to offer. The following morning, I walked the perimeter of my garden, noting the green shoots pushing through the soil, the buds forming on the lilac bushes I had transplanted from the main garden. Spring was asserting itself, transforming the landscape, with its inexorable progress. Nature's oldest story, death giving way to renewal, dormancy yielding to growth. Our family was experiencing its own springtime, I reflected. The painful winter of confrontation and revelation had been necessary, clearing away dead wood, preparing the ground for new growth. Now we were seeing the first tentative blooms of a healthier pattern, a more balanced dynamic. There would be setbacks, of course, old habits reasserting themselves, challenging conversations still to be navigated. But standing there in my garden, attached to my home, on land that acknowledged my rightful place, I felt a deep certainty that we had turned a corner that could not be unturned, that the days of my exclusion, my erasure from the family narrative, were permanently behind us. That certainty was affirmed later that day when Thomas delivered a large envelope to my door. "From Jeffrey at the portrait studio," he explained as I examined the unmarked package. "The Christmas photos." Finally, I opened the envelope to find a beautifully bound album, The Pembroke Family, embossed in gold on its leather cover. Inside were dozens of professionally printed photographs from our Christmas gathering, formal portraits and candid shots, group configurations and individual studies. And there I was, in image after image, central, included, undeniably present. My face among the family faces, my smile part of the collective joy. No awkward cropping, no conspicuous absence, just Agatha Pembroke, firmly established in her rightful place within the family circle. "There's something else," Thomas said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a small leather pouch and handed it to me. "I found these when I was going through some old boxes in the attic. Thought you might want them." Inside the pouch were 2 brass keys, aged and tarnished. I recognized them immediately, the original keys to the carriage house from when it had still been used for its intended purpose. Our grandfather's Model T had been stored there when we were children, before it was sold and the space converted to storage. "I thought they might make a nice memento," Thomas explained, "a connection to the building's history." I closed my fingers around the keys, these tangible links to the past. "Thank you," I said, genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "They're perfect." That evening, I placed the keys in a small shadow box along with a photograph from the new album, one of Thomas and me standing together in front of the Christmas tree, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling. I hung it near my front door, a daily reminder of how far we had come, of what had been lost and found again, of the new keys I now held to both my physical home and my place within the family. Summer arrived in Millfield with characteristic New England enthusiasm, hot, humid days interspersed with spectacular afternoon thunderstorms that cleared the air only briefly before the humidity built again. My garden flourished in these conditions, the perennials I had planted in spring now bursting with color, the small vegetable patch yielding more zucchini and tomatoes than one person could possibly consume. I had taken to leaving baskets of fresh produce on the steps of the main house, a small gesture that bridged the physical space between our separate dwellings. Thomas always thanked me warmly. Vivian acknowledged the gifts with a nod, and occasionally a jar of her homemade pesto. In return, it was a quiet exchange, mundane on the surface but significant in its normalcy. The sort of casual interaction that characterizes healthy family relationships. July brought Rebecca's wedding, a perfect summer day with gentle breezes and flawless, blue skies, as if ordered specifically for the occasion. The ceremony took place at Eleanor's Country Club, an expanse of manicured lawns and carefully tended gardens providing a picturesque backdrop for the event. Eleanor and Vivian had orchestrated every detail with military precision, from the exact shade of pink in the floral arrangements to the precise timing of the string quartet's selections. I arrived early at Rebecca's request, bringing my mother's sapphire bracelet as promised. The bridal suite was a flurry of activity. Bridesmaids, in matching robes, a makeup artist applying finishing touches, a photographer capturing candid moments. In the center of this controlled chaos sat Rebecca, looking remarkably calm in her half-completed wedding ensemble. "Aunt Aggie," she greeted me warmly, rising to embrace me. "You're here. Perfect timing." Vivian, adjusting a flower in one bridesmaid's hair, glanced over with a tight smile. "Hello, Agatha. You look nice." Her tone was cordial, if not effusive, her gaze lingering briefly on my pale blue dress, a color that complemented but did not compete with the bridal party's palette, as specified in Eleanor's detailed email regarding guest attire. "Thank you," I replied, equally polite. "Everything looks beautiful." Rebecca drew me to a quiet corner, away from the bustle. "Did you bring it? The bracelet?" I opened my purse and withdrew the velvet pouch, unveiling the delicate silver bracelet, with its sapphire pendant that had been my mother's most treasured piece of jewelry. "It's been cleaned and the clasp checked. Good as new." "It's perfect," Rebecca breathed, extending her wrist for me to fasten it. The sapphire gleamed against her skin, a vivid blue accent to her otherwise classic bridal white. "How does it look?" "Beautiful," I said, genuinely moved by the sight of my mother's bracelet adorning her granddaughter on this significant day. "Mother would have been so pleased to see you wearing it." Rebecca smiled, an unexpectedly vulnerable expression crossing her usually composed features. "I wish I had known her better. I was so young when she died." "She would have adored the woman you've become," I told her, speaking a truth I hadn't fully articulated before. "She valued integrity, intelligence, and kindness. You have all three." A soft cough interrupted us. Vivian stood nearby, holding Rebecca's veil, her expression carefully neutral. "It's time for the final preparations," she said. "The ceremony starts in 30 minutes. I nodded, squeezing Rebecca's hand one last time before stepping back to allow Vivian to resume her maternal duties. As I turned to leave, Rebecca called after me. "Aunt Aggie, remember you're reading the poem right after the Unity candle. And then you'll sit with Dad in the front row for the rest of the ceremony." I nodded, noting the slight tightening around Vivian's mouth at this confirmation of my prominent role in the proceedings. It wasn't a position I had sought or expected, but I was touched by Rebecca's insistence that I participate fully in her special day. The ceremony unfolded exactly as planned, a testament to Eleanor and Vivian's meticulous preparation. When my moment came to read the sonnet, I approached the small podium with steady steps, unfolded the paper with the familiar words, and looked out at the assembled guests. Friends, family, colleagues, all gathered to witness this union. "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways," I began, my voice clear and measured, carrying across the garden setting. As I continued through the familiar lines, I found my gaze drawn not to the bride and groom, but to Thomas, seated in the front row, his eyes bright with unshed tears. In that moment, I felt a wave of gratitude for our reconciliation, for the chance to share this milestone not as an outsider, but as an integral part of the family. The reception that followed was elegant and joyful, exactly the celebration Rebecca deserved. I found myself seated at the family table, another quiet acknowledgement of my reinstated position, between Thomas and Sophie, who kept up a running commentary on the other guests' attire and dance floor abilities. "Grandma Eleanor looks like she's actually enjoying herself," Sophie observed, nodding toward her great-grandmother, who was engaged in animated conversation with David's parents. "I've never seen her laugh so much." Weddings have a way of softening even the most formidable personalities, I replied, sipping my champagne. "It's hard to maintain complete decorum when faced with such obvious happiness." Thomas leaned closer, his voice lowered for my ears only. "Speaking of formidable personalities, have you noticed Vivian?" I glanced discreetly toward my sister-in-law, who was circulating among the guests with practiced grace, her social smile firmly in place. "She seems to be playing her hostess role perfectly." "Yes, but look closer. She's been stopping at your friend's table regularly, chatting with Jean for quite a while earlier. I think she's actually making an effort to connect with your circle." I observed more carefully and realized he was right. Vivian was indeed paying special attention to my friends, to the people who formed my support network outside the family. It was a subtle gesture, but a meaningful one, an extension of the tentative peace we had established, a recognition that my world had value and validity on its own terms. As the evening progressed and the dancing began in earnest, I found myself approached by a distinguished-looking man I recognized as one of David's uncles, a literature professor from Boston, whom I had met briefly during the rehearsal dinner. "Ms. Pembroke," he greeted me, extending his hand. "Your reading during the ceremony was magnificent. Barrett Browning delivered with genuine feeling and perfect diction, a rare combination." "Thank you," I replied, pleased by the compliment. "The poem is a favorite of mine. I was honored when Rebecca asked me to read it." "Rebecca mentioned you were an English teacher for many years," he continued. "At the local high school, I believe?" "Yes, for over 30 years. I retired just last year." "A noble profession," he said with evident sincerity. "Shaping young minds, introducing them to the power of language and literature. I've always held secondary educators in the highest regard. You're on the front lines, so to speak." His genuine respect for my career, his assumption of its value without qualification, struck a chord. How rare it had been within my family circle to have my professional identity acknowledged as meaningful, as worthy of admiration rather than dismissed as a mere job, or worse, an unfortunate necessity. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, gesturing toward the floor where couples swayed to a slow ballad. "Unless you'd prefer to continue sitting, of course." The invitation surprised me. I had not danced at a social function in longer than I could remember, but I found myself accepting with unexpected eagerness. "I'd be delighted, Professor Collins. Though I should warn you, I'm rather out of practice." "James, please," he corrected gently. "And I assure you, my own dancing skills are functional at best. We can muddle through together." As we moved to the dance floor, I caught Thomas watching us, a speculative smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I gave him a quelling look, which only broadened his grin. Brothers, it seemed, never entirely outgrew the urge to tease, regardless of age or circumstance. James proved to be an agreeable dance partner and an even more engaging conversationalist. As we circled the floor, we discovered a shared passion for early 20th century American literature, a similar disenchantment with certain contemporary bestsellers, and a mutual belief in the enduring importance of poetry in an increasingly digital world. "I'm co-chairing a conference on Wharton next spring," he mentioned as the music shifted to a slightly faster tempo. "At Williams College. Small gathering, deliberately intimate, focusing on her later works. You should consider attending." "That sounds fascinating," I replied, genuinely intrigued by the prospect. I've always felt The Age of Innocence receives disproportionate attention compared to her later novels. "Exactly." His face lit with the enthusiasm of a scholar finding unexpected common ground. "Everyone fixates on the New York novels, but her later explorations of American expatriates in Europe offer such rich territory. I'm presenting a paper on The Mother's Recompense that I think you might find interesting." The conversation continued through 2 more dances before we were interrupted by the announcement that the bride and groom would soon be departing. We joined the other guests in forming a corridor for Rebecca and David to pass through, showering them with dried lavender from small sachets provided for the occasion. As Rebecca moved down the line, she paused briefly before me, her expression luminous with happiness. She pressed a small bouquet into my hands. Not her main bridal arrangement, but a smaller, complementary one that matched the centerpieces. "Thank you," she whispered, embracing me quickly. "For the bracelet, for the reading, for everything." The simple acknowledgement, offered without prompting in the midst of her departure, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I hugged her back, unable to form words, hoping she understood all I wished for her: joy, partnership, the strength to forge her own path even within the constraints of family expectations. As the newlyweds drove away in a shower of lavender and well wishes, I found myself standing beside Vivian, both of us waving until the car disappeared from view. "She looked beautiful," I said into the momentary silence between us. Vivian nodded, her composure slipping just slightly to reveal the emotional mother beneath. She did. Happier than I've ever seen her. You and Eleanor did a magnificent job. With the arrangements, I offered, a genuine compliment rather than mere politeness. Everything was perfect. Not entirely perfect, Vivian replied with a small, rueful smile. The cake was slightly lopsided on one side, and the string quartet started Canon in D 17 seconds early, but close enough. The unexpected touch of self-deprecation, the willingness to acknowledge imperfection, surprised me. It was a small crack in Vivian's carefully maintained facade, a glimpse of the woman beneath the polished exterior. No one noticed either of those things, I assured her. They'll remember the overall beauty, the joy of the occasion. Perhaps, she conceded. Then, after a slight hesitation, you seem to be enjoying your conversation with James Collins. He's quite distinguished in his field, I understand. Was that a note of approval in her voice, or merely observation? With Vivian, it was often difficult to discern the subtle shadings of meaning. He's very knowledgeable, I replied carefully. We share an interest in Edith Wharton's work. Vivian nodded, her expression unreadable. He's a widower. 5 years now, I believe. David mentioned that he divides his time between Boston and a cottage on Cape Cod. The deliberate provision of this information, offered without solicitation, struck me as significant. Was Vivian facilitating? Playing matchmaker? The concept was so foreign to our established dynamic that I hardly knew how to respond. Before I could formulate a reply, Thomas joined us, slipping his arm around Vivian's waist in a gesture of comfortable affection. Quite a day, he observed. I think we can call it an unqualified success. Nearly unqualified, Vivian corrected, exchanging a glance with me that felt, improbably, like the beginning of an inside joke. There was the cake issue. Thomas looked between us, clearly sensing some shift in the atmosphere but unable to identify its nature. Well, I didn't notice anything amiss with the cake. It tasted delicious, which is the important part. Of course you'd say that, Vivian replied, but the familiar criticism held a tone of fondness rather than censure. You'd eat sawdust if it had enough frosting. The three of us stood together for a moment, watching as the remaining guests began to disperse, the evening winding to its natural conclusion. It struck me that we had achieved something I had once thought impossible, a family dynamic that accommodated all of us, that allowed each of us our dignity, our place, our voice. Not perfect, certainly, but functional. Even, at times, warm. Later that night, as I returned to the carriage house, weary but content, I found a small package propped against my door. Opening it, I discovered a beautifully bound edition of Edith Wharton's later novels, with a note tucked inside. Ms. Pembroke, Agatha, if I may. Our conversation this evening was a highlight of the wedding for me. I've taken the liberty of leaving. This volume, which contains excellent critical introductions to each novel that I think you'll appreciate. I'll be in Millfield next month for an academic committee meeting. Perhaps we might continue our discussion over dinner? With admiration, James Collins. His phone number followed, written in a precise, scholarly hand. I stood on my doorstep, the book cradled in my hands, experiencing a sensation I hadn't felt in decades. A flutter of anticipation, of possibility. At 68, I had long since resigned myself to a life without romantic companionship, had convinced myself that I was complete without it, content in my independence. And perhaps I was. But this unexpected connection, this shared intellectual excitement, opened a door I had thought permanently closed. Summer gave way to autumn, the trees around the property blazing with color before surrendering their leaves to the increasingly brisk wind. My relationship with James developed slowly, deliberately, built on long conversations and shared literary passions. He visited Millfield regularly, and I occasionally traveled to Boston for concerts or museum exhibitions he thought I might enjoy. We were careful, measured in our expectations. Both of us shaped by decades of life experience that counseled patience and realistic assessment. "He seems very suitable," was Eleanor's verdict after meeting James at Thanksgiving dinner, an event I had hosted in my carriage house, much to everyone's surprise. The space had accommodated us all comfortably, with Sophie and Michael seated at a small table near the fireplace, the adults around my dining table, which had been expanded with borrowed leaves from the main house. "Suitable," I echoed, amused by her characteristic assessment as we washed dishes together afterward. "He's not a winter coat, Eleanor." "You know perfectly well what I mean," she replied, efficiently drying a serving platter. "Intellectual compatibility is essential at your age. You're past the point where physical attraction alone sustains a relationship." "Are we?" I countered, unable to resist teasing her slightly. I wasn't aware there was an expiration date on such matters. A hint of color touched her cheeks, but she continued undeterred. "I simply meant that you've chosen wisely. He respects your mind, your accomplishments. That's important." The fact that Eleanor was discussing my romantic life at all, offering what amounted to approval, was yet another sign of my changed status within the family. No longer the spinster aunt to be pitied or dismissed, I was now a woman making active choices about her life, worthy of consideration and, apparently, relationship advice. Winter arrived with its usual severity, blanketing the property in snow that transformed the landscape into a monochrome study of white on white. I found the carriage house remarkably cozy in these conditions, the new insulation and heating system performing admirably even during the coldest nights. From my upstairs window, I could see the main house illuminated across the snow-covered lawn, windows glowing with warmth, occasional shadows moving behind curtains, the reassuring evidence of family life continuing its steady rhythm. Christmas approached, and with it came the inevitable discussions about celebrations and traditions. This year, however, the planning included me from the outset, my preferences and availability considered alongside everyone else's. "We thought Christmas Eve dinner at the main house," Thomas proposed during one of our regular Sunday afternoon. "Coffees, a habit we had established over the months. Then Christmas morning at your place, if that works for you. Sophie is particularly keen on seeing what Santa leaves under your tree." "Sophie is 16, I pointed out, warming my hands on my coffee mug. "I think we can dispense with the Santa pretense." "Try telling her that," Thomas replied with a grin. "She insists that believing in Santa is a state of mind, not an age-dependent condition." I laughed, recognizing Sophie's particular blend of adolescent wisdom and childlike enthusiasm. Well, far be it from me to disrupt her state of mind. Christmas morning here sounds perfect. As we continued discussing logistics, what dishes I would prepare, what time the children typically woke, how we would coordinate gift exchanges, I was struck by the naturalness of it all, the ease with which I had been incorporated into the holiday planning. No more last-minute invitations, no more carefully orchestrated exclusions disguised as oversights. I was part of the conversation. From the beginning, my home as much a center of family activity as the main house. "James is welcome to join us, of course," Thomas added casually, "if he doesn't have other commitments." The invitation, extended without hesitation, represented yet another acknowledgement of my reconfigured life, the understanding that James had become significant to me, that my relationships outside the family were valid and valued. "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. "He'll be with his daughter in Connecticut for Christmas Eve, but he might drive up for Christmas Day. I'll let you know." Thomas nodded, making a mental note. "Perfect. And speaking of James..." He hesitated, uncharacteristically tentative. "He seems like a good man, Aggie. You deserve that. You deserve someone who sees your worth clearly." The simple affirmation, offered without qualification, stirred an unexpected wave of emotion. For so long, my worth within the family had been measured primarily by what I could provide: financial support, practical assistance, unobtrusive accommodation of others' needs. To be recognized now as deserving happiness for my own sake, to have my brother actively affirm my right to companionship and respect, felt like the final piece of a long, incomplete puzzle falling into place. "Thank you," I managed, blinking. Back sudden tears. "That means a great deal, coming from you." Winter deepened, the days growing shorter, darkness falling by mid-afternoon. Yet even in this darkest season, I found myself filled with an unexpected sense of lightness, of possibility. My home was warm and welcoming, my place in the family secure, my relationship with James unfolding with promising depth and mutual respect. At 68, when many might consider life's major developments behind them, I was discovering new chapters, new connections, new ways of being in the world. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside the dining room windows of the main house, I looked around the table at the assembled family. Thomas carving the roast with exaggerated ceremony, Vivian fussing over the perfect arrangement of side dishes, Michael absorbed in his phone until Eleanor's sharp glance made him set it aside, Sophie chattering about the college applications she would begin next year, Rebecca and David visiting from their new apartment in Boston, and me, seated at the table not as a guest but as family, photographed extensively before dinner without a hint of the exclusion that had sparked this entire transformation. The Christmas card had already been sent, my image prominently featured. Among the family group, no awkward cropping, no convenient absences. The complete Pembroke family. The caption read, just as Vivian had promised. As we raised our glasses in a toast to the season, to family, to health and happiness, I caught Thomas's eye across the table. He gave me a small private smile, an acknowledgement of how far we had come, of the painful but necessary journey that had brought us to this moment of genuine togetherness. Later, walking back to the carriage house through the gently falling snow, I paused midway between the two buildings, looking back at the main house with its warmly lit windows, then forward to my own home, equally inviting in the winter night. In that moment, standing between the two dwellings that together formed the complete Pembroke estate, I felt a profound sense of rightness, of balance restored. The journey from exclusion to inclusion, from invisibility to recognition, had been neither simple nor painless. It had required confrontation, revelation, the courage to demand what I deserved rather than accept what I was offered. But standing there in the quiet winter night, I knew with absolute certainty that every difficult moment had been worth it, that in fighting for my place in the family photograph, I had ultimately secured something far more valuable: my place in the family itself, seen and valued exactly as I was. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.